February 1258. Baghdad was still standing, but it was already finished. The fires had not yet reached every street. The screams had not yet filled every alley, but power was already dead, and the city felt it in ways words could not explain. Inside the treasury, where gold lay stacked like walls within walls, the Caliph walked in silence. Al-Mustasim, successor of prophets, ruler of the richest city on earth, was being marched forward by guards who did not belong to him. Their hands rested calmly on their weapons. They were not here to escort a ruler. They were here to watch a man understand. Gold surrounded him on every side, unused, untouched, piled higher than the men who had died, defending walls he never reinforced. This was not a ceremony. There were no prayers, no speeches, no final honors. This walk had only one purpose: to strip power of its illusion before removing it from the world. Outside, Baghdad burned slowly, not in chaos, but in stages, as if the city itself was being erased layer by layer. The fountains had stopped running, something that only happened when authority had already collapsed. Markets were silent. Mosques stood open, but the air felt empty, as though even God was holding his breath. For 5 centuries, this city had believed itself eternal. Empires rose and fell beyond its walls, yet Baghdad endured. It had survived civil wars, rival caliphs, internal decay, and endless political weakness, because knowledge kept flowing, trade kept moving, and life kept working. That illusion was now dying in real time. Baghdad was not just a capital. It was the axis of the world. Greek philosophy lived here beside Persian astronomy. Indian mathematics merged with Islamic law. Libraries held knowledge that would take lifetimes to read. Hospitals treated the poor and the rich alike. Scholars crossed deserts just to sit in its halls. This was not a civilization in decline. This was a system functioning at full capacity, ruled by a man who believed that history itself would protect him. Al-Mustasim had inherited not only a title, but a dangerous assumption: that tradition was stronger than armies, that gold could replace preparation, and that sacred status could stop steel. The Mongols did not see it that way. They had never cared for symbols, lineage, or memory. They did not come to debate theology or negotiate prestige. They came with a system refined over 50 years of continuous war, a method that turned destruction into instruction. Cities that submitted lived. Cities that hesitated disappeared. There was no rage in it, no passion, no hatred. Only process, only outcome. Baghdad had received the message, read the words, argued over them, and chosen delay. Delay was enough. As the Caliph was led deeper into the palace corridors, past doors that once opened at his command, the truth finally began to surface. This was not punishment for failure. This was demonstration. What would happen to him and to his family was not meant to be merciful, quick, or even efficient. It was meant to be remembered. The Mongols did not come to take Baghdad. They came to make sure no ruler ever forgot what happens when power mistakes gold for strength. And before the next call to prayer, the world's greatest city would learn that nothing sacred survives force. For 500 years, Baghdad had trained itself to believe in permanence, not because it was powerful, but because it was useful to the world. Knowledge flowed through its streets like blood through veins, steady and assumed, never questioned. While armies clashed elsewhere, Baghdad read, wrote, calculated, healed, and traded. It survived weakness because weakness had never truly punished it before. Each generation inherited the same quiet confidence that the city was too important to fall, too valuable to destroy, too sacred to be touched. That belief became its strongest comfort and its deadliest flaw. Inside its walls, life had continued even as warnings arrived from the east. Cities erased, kingdoms emptied, entire populations gone, not scattered, not conquered, but removed. Yet Baghdad watched and waited, because it always had. When others burned, Baghdad endured. When others collapsed, Baghdad adapted. The markets remained full. The library stayed open. The call to prayer echoed as it always had. The city mistook survival for invincibility and memory for preparation. The Caliph's authority reflected that illusion. He was not just a ruler, but a symbol stretched across centuries. His lineage traced back to prophecy itself. His name was spoken in sermons far beyond Baghdad's reach. In theory, this made him untouchable. In practice, it made him cautious, detached, and dangerously confident. His treasury overflowed, yet the walls were neglected. His title commanded reverence, yet his armies were fragmented, underpaid, and unready. He trusted that the weight of history would do the work steel had not. Baghdad had everything except urgency. Its scholars debated while other cities prepared. Its officials argued while the horizon darkened. Some warned of the Mongols' methodical destruction, not as rumor, but as documented fact. Others dismissed them as riders of open plains, unsuited for a city that had never fallen. And some believed something deeper and more fatal, that divine protection would intervene, that pagans could not erase the center of Islamic civilization. Faith replaced strategy. Tradition replaced readiness. Hope replaced action. What Baghdad failed to understand was that the Mongols were not impressed by greatness. They had crushed cities older than memory, stronger than reputation, and richer than Baghdad itself. They did not measure a place by its libraries or its legacy. They measured compliance. A city that submitted early lived on, wounded but breathing. A city that hesitated became an example. Baghdad did not refuse outright. It delayed. It debated. It trusted that time would soften the threat. Time, in this case, was the weapon. As days passed, the illusion held. The walls still stood. The streets still functioned. Life continued just enough to make denial comfortable. But beyond the horizon, preparations were already complete. Engineers assembled machines designed specifically for Baghdad's defenses. Routes were mapped, rivers studied, gates counted. Nothing was rushed because nothing needed to be. The Mongols understood something Baghdad did not, that a city does not fall when its walls break, but when its leaders believe walls are enough. By the time the Caliph's court realized that eternity was not a shield, it was already too late. The city that believed itself permanent was about to learn the most brutal lesson history offers. That knowledge does not stop conquest, memory does not block force, and greatness, when unprotected, only makes destruction louder. The Mongols were never mistaken for chaos by those who truly watched them. From a distance, they appeared like a storm, sudden and overwhelming, but storms pass. What approached Baghdad did not pass. It arrived, paused, and began to work. This was not an army driven by anger or hunger. It was a machine built from doctrine, discipline, and repetition, refined across decades of uninterrupted conquest. Every movement had been tested, every response predicted, every outcome rehearsed long before the first horse reached the horizon. The Mongol system followed a pattern so consistent it frightened those who recognized it. First came the message. A small group of riders, calm, unthreatening, carrying written terms. Submit immediately. Dismantle fortifications. Send tribute. Provide hostages. Accept authority. The message never changed because it did not need to. Cities that accepted lived. Cities that refused disappeared. There was no negotiation, no revision, no compromise. Only choice. When a city hesitated, nothing happened at first. Days passed, sometimes weeks. Life inside the walls continued, and hope crept back into the streets. People told themselves the Mongols had turned away, that distance or logistics had defeated them. That pause was deliberate. It was part of the system. It allowed complacency to return. It allowed defenders to relax. It allowed leaders to believe they had been right all along. And the horizon filled. The Mongols did not retreat. They surrounded. every road sealed, every gate observed, every escape route closed. Camps appeared with mechanical precision, laid out not for comfort, but for efficiency. Siege engines arrived on wagons, hauled by animals that did not panic under noise or fire. Engineers from distant lands worked beside Mongol soldiers, assembling machines designed specifically for the walls they faced. Trebuchets rose in full view of the defenders, stone by stone, arm by arm. The message was clear. This was not improvisation. This was preparation meeting its target. A second embassy followed. The same words. The same terms. The final chance. Many cities surrendered here, broken not by force, but by certainty. Those that did not were not rushed. The siege began like a procedure, not an assault. Walls were tested, measured, and breached in calculated sections. Infantry advanced in units. Cavalry secured the perimeter. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary loss. Even violence followed rules. When the walls fell, the killing did not explode. It organized. Populations were gathered and sorted. Artisans were separated. Engineers identified. Scholars marked. Those with skills were spared, not out of mercy, but utility. The rest were removed. What followed was recorded by survivors, chroniclers, and enemies alike. It was not random slaughter. It was systematic elimination, carried out to ensure memory would do what fear alone could not. Cities were burned, not in rage, but as proof. Proof that refusal had consequences. Proof that delay was fatal. Proof that resistance invited erasure. Survivors were resettled far away, spread across the empire, living reminders of what compliance preserved and defiance destroyed. By the time the Mongol system reached Baghdad, it had already erased empires. Nothing about the city surprised it. Nothing about its wealth impressed it. Baghdad was simply the next instruction. And as the machine settled into place, the city that believed negotiation would come began to understand the truth. This enemy did not argue, persuade, or bargain. It only waited, surrounded, and completed its work. The council that chose wrong, inside the palace. While the Mongol camps tightened around Baghdad, the Caliph's council fractured under the weight of its own fear. The room was filled with men who had spent their lives debating law, theology, and court politics, not survival. Each voice carried confidence, but none carried certainty. Reports from the east were no longer rumors. They were facts written in ash. Cities stronger than Baghdad had vanished. Walls thicker than Baghdad's had fallen. Armies larger than Baghdad's had been erased. Yet knowledge did not produce unity. It produced argument. The Caliph listened as advisors spoke past one another, each clinging to the belief that best protected his own pride. One faction urged immediate submission. They did not speak in poetry or faith, but in numbers and evidence. They described the Mongol system in detail, how resistance did not delay destruction, but guaranteed it, how cities that opened their gates still lived, wounded but intact. They argued that Baghdad's wealth could buy survival, that tribute was cheaper than annihilation, that humility now would preserve everything later. Their words were calm, measured, and terrifying because they were correct. But correctness is rarely persuasive when it demands surrender. Another faction rejected the idea outright. Baghdad's walls had never been breached. The city had survived crises before. The Mongols, they insisted, were cavalry fighters, masters of open land, far from their supply lines. A long siege would exhaust them. Distance would weaken them. History would repeat itself, and Baghdad would endure as it always had. This argument appealed not to evidence, but to memory. It reassured rather than warned, and reassurance was what many wanted to hear. Then came the voices of faith. Baghdad was not just a city. It was the seat of the Caliphate, the symbolic heart of Islamic civilization. To them, the idea that pagan conquerors could erase the lineage of the Prophet was unthinkable. God would not allow it. Divine protection would intervene as it had in past trials. To prepare for destruction was, in their eyes, to doubt providence itself. Faith replaced strategy, and confidence replaced caution. The Caliph absorbed these arguments in silence. He was a man raised in ceremony, surrounded by scholars, accustomed to deference. He had inherited power, not seized it, and that inheritance shaped his decisions. He trusted that status mattered, that titles restrained enemies, that history respected continuity. He believed that delay created options, not danger, so he hesitated. He sent no tribute. He dismantled no walls. He offered no hostages. He chose dignity over survival, tradition over adaptation. Outside the palace, the city waited. Inside, the council dissolved without resolution. No decisive order was given. No preparation accelerated. Time slipped forward, unnoticed, irreversible. The Mongols did not react to the silence. They did not threaten. They did not negotiate. They continued building, measuring, preparing, as if the decision had already been made for Baghdad. By the time the Caliph realized that the debate itself had been the fatal choice, the horizon was sealed, the engines were ready, and the last opportunity for mercy had passed. Baghdad had not been defeated by force yet. It had been defeated by hesitation. And as the city prepared for a siege, it could not win. The council that chose wrong would soon learn that some mistakes are not corrected by regret, only recorded by history. What happened after the gates fell? When Baghdad's walls finally broke, the city did not collapse in a single scream. It unraveled in silence first. The gates opened not to negotiation, but to certainty. Mongol forces moved through the breaches with discipline that felt almost unnatural. There was no chaos, no rush to plunder, no wild destruction. This was not rage released. It was a task being completed. Streets were secured. Districts were sealed. Orders were followed without hesitation. The city that had believed itself eternal was now being processed. The population was gathered, separated, and judged without emotion. Craftsmen were pulled from the crowds. Engineers, physicians, scribes, and scholars were marked and removed. Their survival was not kindness, it was utility. Knowledge, when portable, was spared. Everything else was excess. Entire neighborhoods were emptied methodically. Families were broken apart without ceremony. What followed was not written to inspire fear in the moment, but to instruct generations yet unborn. Baghdad was becoming a lesson. Inside the palace, the Caliph and his family were no longer rulers. They were symbols awaiting correction. Their treatment was deliberate, slow, and public enough to be remembered. They were not executed immediately, because speed would have wasted meaning. The Mongols understood something ancient, that humiliation lasts longer than death. The royal family was stripped of authority first, then dignity, then expectation. They were shown the wealth they had hoarded while the walls weakened, forced to walk past gold that could no longer buy time, mercy, or relevance. The Caliph was not judged in a court. He was not granted the dignity of a public execution. He was reduced to proof. Chroniclers would later struggle to describe his end, not because it was unclear, but because it was designed to avoid martyrdom. Blood was not meant to sanctify him. Memory was meant to erase him. His death was calculated to deny meaning, to strip even tragedy of honor. What happened to his family followed the same logic. They were not spared because of lineage. They were not spared because of innocence. They were erased because symbols cannot be allowed to survive defeat. Meanwhile, the city itself was destroyed with precision. Libraries were emptied into the river. Manuscripts that carried centuries of thought dissolved into blackened water. The house of wisdom, once the heart of human knowledge, fell without ceremony. Hospitals were dismantled. Markets burned. Canals collapsed. This was not destruction driven by ignorance. It was destruction driven by strategy. Baghdad was not being punished. It was being removed from the future. Survivors were scattered across distant lands. carrying stories they would struggle to explain. The silence left behind was intentional. A ruined city speaks louder than a conquered one. The Mongols did not stay to rule. They stayed long enough to ensure memory would do their work for them. When they finally moved on, Baghdad was no longer a city. It was a warning etched into the earth. And as the smoke settled over what had once been the center of the world, one truth became impossible to deny. The worst fate was not death itself, but being reduced to a lesson for others, stripped of meaning, legacy, and voice. In Baghdad, even memory was conquered. When power learned its final lesson, when the Mongols finally left Baghdad, they did not leave behind a conquered capital. They left behind absence. The city that had once anchored the world was now a hollow space where memory struggled to survive. Roads led nowhere. Canals no longer carried water. The river that once reflected libraries and palaces now carried fragments of ink and ash, as if knowledge itself had been bled out and sent downstream. There was no proclamation of victory, no ceremony to mark the end. The silence was the conclusion. Baghdad's destruction did not echo because it was loud. It echoed because it was final. Other cities would rebuild. Other capitals would recover. Baghdad would not. Something essential had been removed, not just buildings or people, but continuity. For centuries, scholars had assumed that knowledge, once gathered, could not truly be lost. That books could always be rewritten, ideas rediscovered, truths remembered. Baghdad proved that assumption wrong. Knowledge, when concentrated, is fragile. Civilization, when centralized, can be erased in a single season. The Mongols understood this more clearly than anyone else. They did not see history as sacred. They saw it as instructional. Baghdad was not destroyed in anger or revenge. It was dismantled to send a message across continents and generations. Power that mistakes wealth for strength invites correction. Authority that hides behind tradition invites exposure. Civilizations that believe themselves untouchable stop preparing for the moment they will be touched. The Caliphate did not end because one man failed. It ended because a system trusted memory more than reality, because it believed prestige could replace readiness, because it assumed that the past guaranteed the future. When the Mongols stripped the Caliph and his family of dignity, they were not punishing individuals. They were dismantling an idea that legitimacy alone could command survival. Once that idea died, the institution followed it into silence. For the survivors scattered across distant lands, Baghdad became a story that felt unreal even as they told it. How could the center of the world simply vanish? How could centuries of thought be undone so quickly? The answer was uncomfortable, so history softened it. Over time, the details blurred. The brutality became abstract. The lesson faded into dates and footnotes. Humanity prefers ruins when they are distant, tragedies when they are finished. But the truth remains, buried beneath ash and water. Baghdad did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it believed it was eternal. The Mongols did not destroy it to rule it. They destroyed it to warn the next city, the next ruler, the next civilization that would confuse greatness with immunity. Power, when unexamined, invites forces that do not care about meaning. In the end, Baghdad's greatest loss was not its people, its gold, or its walls. It was the illusion that civilization moves in one direction, always forward, always safer than before. History proved otherwise in 1258. It reminded the world that nothing sacred survives force forever, and that when power forgets this truth, it does not fade quietly. It disappears, leaving only silence where certainty once stood.